Who were the vampires before Dracula? Come with me to NERD Nite LA and I'll tell you all about it.
Our second presenter knows quite a bit about vampires before Dracula's existence, and I know nothing about it. So I'm really excited to learn about it. I hope you are too. Sean, everyone.
Thank you very much, Nerd Nite. Thank you guys all very much for coming out here to learn about vampires before Dracula. My name is Sean Rourke, and I have a YouTube channel that is, sorry, I'm just learning how to use this device in my hand. I have a YouTube channel called The Vampire's Castle, where I basically do a lot of videos about vampires, resources for people who are writing vampire stories, if you happen to be one of those people, interviews with vampire authors, talks about vampires, that sort of thing. And I'm obviously a big fan of this guy right here. But one of the things that I am very passionate about is how we got to Dracula. What was the process by which the greatest, most famous vampire came to be? And that has a lot to do with the vampires that came before him in literature. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about tonight, is vampires in literature. So we're going to start this off with the next slide. Okay, thank you. The next slide, we're going to go back to the 1700s. This is sort of where it all begins, because at this point in time, there is a vampire craze that erupts, somewhere between the late 1600s, early 1700s. And this has a lot to do with the printing press becoming rather ubiquitous. There were suddenly printed journals that were being read in Western Europe about vampire cases in Eastern Europe. And these were cases of the dead rising from their graves and harassing the living by night and drinking their blood. And so Western Europe just went crazy over this because it seemed to be scientifically proven. Spoiler alert, that's not real. But it certainly seemed like it at the time. So there was a lot of discussion about vampires, but there weren't actually any vampire characters until we reached 1748. And the first vampire characters that we get are all the work of poets. And the very first one of these was a guy by the name of, thank you very much, Heinrich August Ossenfelder. And he wrote a vampire poem called Der Vampyre, or The Vampire. And it's a very, very short poem. You can find, by the way, you can find all of these online and read them for yourselves if you're interested in that sort of thing. But it's basically a vampire who is telling a young girl named Christine that his love for her is better than that of her family's because all they can do is just love her with their hearts, whereas he can take her into death by drinking her blood, and that is a far more intimate type of love. So that's where we're starting. And then after Der Vampyre, we jump ahead to 1797, and there have been some vampires showing up here and there, but the next major one is a poem entitled The Bride of Corinth, and that is by a guy named Goethe, who you may have heard of before. And in The Bride of Corinth, we have our very first female vampire character. And yes, indeed, the Bride of Corinth is a tragic figure who died before her wedding night, and then afterwards, her groom receives a visitation by her in his room at night. And she basically climbs on top of him and says, "I want to be with you forever. I can make that happen." And then her parents bust into the room and they're like, begone demon, and she runs away, and that's sadly how that story goes. But like I say, that is our very first female vampire. And then we come to sort of our, probably one of the most important ones as far as the poetry goes. In 1816, there's a guy by the name of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who also is the first one that I could find a picture of. So that's him right there. And he writes a story that is called Christabel. And again, this is still a poem. But in the story of Christabel, we have a young character named Christabel, who's a young woman. She's wandering through the forest right at dusk. She comes across another young girl who is distressed, who is named Geraldine, or I think I'm supposed to pronounce it Geraldine so that it rhymes with other things in the poem, but I'm just going to go with Geraldine. And Geraldine says, I was kidnapped by these guys, but I got away from them. And Christabel's like, oh my God, come back to my castle. We'll take care of you. And so she takes Geraldine back to the castle, but right at the threshold of the castle, Geraldine crumples down to the ground. And she can't follow until Christabel says, come on in. And then suddenly Geraldine gets up and she comes inside. She meets Christabel's father, who is like, oh, this is wonderful. My daughter has been so lonely. Finally, another girl her age to keep her company. You're very welcome here. We will make you better. And then the two of them, Christabel and Geraldine, go to bed. And Geraldine climbs in bed with Christabel, and they have passionate sex. And over the course of several days and nights, Christabel, her health gets worse and worse, while Geraldine's gets better and better. Now, the word vampire is never actually used in this poem, but I want you to remember this because it will become important very shortly. So after the publication of Christabel, we get to the year 1815. And this is where a volcanic upheaval takes place in the vampire genre. And it's actually a literal volcano. It's actually Mount Tambora in Indonesia is the volcano that happens. It basically explodes, and which is all the way on the other side of the world from Europe, but because of the amount of volcanic matter that goes into the atmosphere, that following summer, 1816, is called the year without a summer. And that's because the world was in the middle of a volcanic winter. So there were crop failures all over the planet, especially in the northern hemisphere. There was heavy rain. Skies were cloudy all the time. There was snow in some places. And in Geneva, Switzerland, there was, I could see some people are already excited about this. You know what's coming. There was a place called the Villa Diodati. I'm sure I pronounced that right. There's no reason to check it. So there was this villa, and due to the inclement weather, there were several travelers who kind of all were sort of stuck inside. The first of which was a guy by the name of Lord Byron. Okay, we have some Byron fans here. Byron was a sort of a very famous, one of the great romance poets of English literature. He was also just an absolute scoundrel in a lot of ways, but very well loved. And he was traveling with his friend and personal physician, who was Dr. John Polidori. And because back in those days, if you're going to travel the continent, you should bring a doctor with you because you don't know what's going to happen to you. While they were at the villa, they ran into Byron's friend and poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley. And Shelley's young, soon-to-be wife, Mary Godwin, who became Mary Shelley. So they're all stuck inside at this villa, and Lord Byron says, let's tell some ghost stories. It's the middle of the summer, it's raining, it's snowing outside, let's tell some You know what? Let's come up with our own ghost stories. And this is where Mary Shelley starts writing Frankenstein. But this is not a talk about Frankenstein, it's a talk about vampires. So this moment is just as important for the vampire genre because Lord Byron starts telling these guys about his idea for a story that he's working on that he eventually publishes, and it is called, there's Lord Byron, and the thing that he publishes is called Fragment of a Novel, which is really not that spooky of a title. But what this is he only got around to writing basically like a chapter, and it's about this guy who's an older gentleman named Augustus Darvel, and he's traveling Europe with a young friend. Darvel is dying. He says, "My friend, take this ring of mine, take it to this one swamp in Greece, throw it in, and then there's an eagle carrying a snake in its talons," and then Darvel dies and immediately decomposes, and then that's it. That's the whole vampire story. But what was supposed to happen after that was that the young traveler then goes back to England and finds Darvel there, perfectly fine, just like he remembers, drinking the blood of his sister and killing her. So John Polidori basically was like, well, I really like that story. I'm going to write my own version of it. So he writes The Vampire. And this is really the very first vampire in literature, in prose, as we know it today. And it's a character whose name is Lord Ruthven. And Lord Ruthven is not an old man. He's a young, very attractive man who moves around English high society, undetected as a vampire, basically bedding young women, ruining people's fortunes, and drinking their blood, and goes traveling around Europe with a young traveling companion. And if you look at what was going on with Lord Byron and Polidori during the time of creating this, you can kind of start seeing some parallels. Basically, Polidori and Byron had a huge falling out shortly after they were at this spot in Switzerland, and there's a lot of scholarship to think that this very negative but suave portrayal of Lord Ruthven is actually just Lord Byron with a different name. So, but what we get is our very first attractive, smooth, couth vampire that is undetected in high society. So then we move on after that to 1819. This is actually just a kind of a quick aside, but it's something I'm excited about because this just came to light recently. And that is that there was a guy named Uriah Derrick d'Arcy. That's a pseudonym. We actually don't know who this was. There's some people with some theories, but this is not the dude's actual name. But he was American. And the year after Polidori's The Vampire was published, this guy publishes a fan fiction prequel to it called The Black Vampire. And the character in this is so this is so new that there is no picture of this character. Like, no one has ever drawn it, no one's ever played it, so I was like, we'll put Reggae Jean Page up there from Bridgerton. Like, you can't, actually, let's change him up just a little bit so that he's a little more vampified there, sort of gets the idea across. So the main character of the Black Vampire is called the African Prince. He never actually gets a name. And the story is ridiculous. I won't take time to go through it because it still wouldn't make any sense. It's sort of an anti-slavery story, but yet also a pro-slavery story at the same time. But the very end of the story has this like basically 10-year-old white boy who is sort of the half-son of the African prince who leaves to go to Europe, and we're led to believe that this kid becomes Lord Ruthven. So Anyway, this story has languished in obscurity until just like 3 years ago. It was kind of dug up and revived. Moving on from that, we're going to jump ahead to 1847 to a vampire story called Varney the Vampire. That's a very catchy name. Varney was a penny dreadful. And what that was that as printing was getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, there was some guy who was like, you know what? I could take just one sheet of white paper and I could print 2 columns of text on each side, fold it in half, and then I've got a little magazine that I can sell to children for a penny, children who love blood-curdling tales of horror. And so that's why they were called penny dreadfuls. And that's not a lot of space to tell a story, so all these stories were serialized. And based on the sales, they would keep a story going until it just wasn't selling anymore. Varney the Vampire ran for 3 years. And but also one of the other conditions was that if you're writing a penny dreadful, you are getting paid by the line, but you don't get a byline credit. So we don't know for sure who wrote it, but scholars think that a guy named James Malcolm Reiner wrote a lot of it until he got tired of it. And then a dude named Thomas Peckett Prest probably took it over, and then James Malcolm Reiner came back to finish it. The whole thing makes no sense. There's no continuity. Varney is a vampire for a while, then he's not. He just thinks he is, but then he is again. He turns someone else into a vampire. He jumps in a volcano. There's all this stuff that happens. So, but the character of Varney is this sort of very ugly, villainous, sort of landed gentry vampire who harasses the high society. Well, actually, it's more like middle society. He doesn't actually even do it all that well. He's kind of inept, but he regularly, it's sort of the scene that the writer really got a lot of mileage of was the vampire crawling into a young maiden's window to drink her blood while she was asleep. Varney does this over and over and over again, and he always gets found out right before he can drink her blood. So, 3 years of that. But Varney, although being extremely popular, has not really been shown all that much in media, unless you count Castlevania, season 4 of it. Varney actually makes an appearance. He's voiced by Malcolm McDowell, and it's actually a pretty, I mean, he turns out to be the Grim Reaper at the end of it, but I'm sorry, I'm ruining all this stuff for you guys, all these spoilers. But that's really kind of one of the only appearances on screen of Varney. Moving on from there, we're going to jump ahead to 1854. This is the crazy one. So there's a short story that's published. There was no attribution to it. It's called The Mysterious Stranger. And this story is Dracula. It is a short story version of Dracula that came out like 25, 30 years before Bram Stoker writes Dracula. And it has to do with a group of young people who are being chased by wolves through the Carpathians, and they are rescued at the last minute by a mysterious guy named the Knight Azo, who hangs out in a haunted castle, only shows up at night, comes by their place on numerous occasions as a thank you, sits with them at dinner without eating anything, and takes an interest in one of the young women who is engaged to be married, starts climbing in her window at night, and over the period of several days, she gets worse and worse. She almost becomes a vampire until somebody figures out what's actually going on. They go to Sir Azo's coffin, and they kill him, and then she suddenly becomes human again. So, that's a lot like Dracula. Now, we don't actually have any proof that Bram Stoker read The Mysterious Stranger, but come on. So anyway, it's an enjoyable short read. I recommend it because most people don't know about this. But the exciting thing just within the last year, there's so much good vampire scholarship going on these days, you guys. But we actually can put a name and a face to this. I have a lot of slides of Sir Azo by himself. To the actual author of this is a guy named Karl von Waxman, a German guy. He actually published this story in 1844, and then it was republished in English. So he published it in German, and then it was republished in English several years later, and they just didn't attribute it to him. So, exactly. So now in the modern age of the internet and all this vampire scholarship, we finally know we can put a face and a name to the guy who most likely inspired the main exciting beats of Dracula. And that's him right there. So, yeah, that's very exciting. So we've got one last one here, and this is one of the most important ones. This is 1871, and we have an author named Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. And Sheridan Le Fanu, he got publishes by Sheridan Le Fanu. He writes a lot of ghost stories, and he writes a story called Carmilla. Excellent. I love it when there are Carmilla fans in the pod. That's fabulous.
I was her for Halloween.
Oh, hey, you're her for Halloween. That is awesome. That's very cool. So everybody else here is like, what the fuck are they talking about? So Carmilla is basically this story about a young girl named Laura who lives with her father alone in a castle. And one day this woman shows up and she's like, I have pressing business. I have to get going. My daughter is not feeling well. My daughter Carmilla, can I leave her here and I'll come back for her? And Laura's dad is like, oh, this is so wonderful. A young girl who's the same age as my daughter and she's so lonely. Yes, we will take care of Carmilla. And Carmilla, as you may guess, is a vampire who then crawls in bed with Laura, and they have a lesbian affair by cover of darkness, and Laura gets weaker and weaker as Carmilla gets stronger and stronger, and then at this point her father figures it out. This is the ending to Christabel we never got. But her father figures it out, and with a bunch of other gentlemen vampire hunters, they go and they find Carmilla, and they stake her and cut off her head and burn her body and throw her in the river, and basically save Laura. So this seems a lot like Christabel. It's unclear whether Sheridan Le Fanu was just sort of homaging a favorite poem of his, or if he was literally like, you know what, I think I could do that better. Or maybe he just wanted to finish it and sort of have his own version of the ending. But the character has actually been adapted a lot. So, for example, The Vampire Lovers is the Hammer movie that is an adaptation of this book, and it's a fabulous film. It's starring Ingrid Pitt as Carmilla. She's sort of the most popular actress to have played her. Some of the younger viewers here may know the Carmilla YouTube show, which ran recently for several seasons. All right. And then she also appeared in Castlevania and was actually the main villain there for about 2 seasons. So Carmilla is sort of like the second most famous vampire after Dracula from this time period. There's one last little interesting fact about this, because Sheridan Le Fanu owned and operated a newspaper. And one of the younger writers for him, who was doing theatrical reviews, was a young guy named Bram Stoker. Yes, that was my reaction when I found this out. So when Stoker was a young man, he was writing theatrical reviews, so he was working for Le Fanu. They must have known one another. Whether they ever had a conversation about vampires or not, we have no idea. But Stoker was definitely influenced by Carmilla. We can tell that by some of the excised material that didn't make it into Dracula, but that was in a previous version before it went to print. And then just, a couple years later in 1897, a year after X-rays were found. We then have Bram Stoker writes his masterwork, which is, of course, one of the great pieces of English and world literature. So that is the road that we take to get to Dracula, and those are sort of, this is how we trace the DNA. Because we've got Lord Ruthven, who, because he was kind of come up with by Byron and might have actually been a stand-in for Byron, we refer to these vampires in evening wear with manners as Byronic vampires, of which Dracula is the most famous. So that traces all the way back to Lord Ruthven there. And then we go to Varney the Vampire, who had some traits like he had fangs, and he also would climb in ladies' windows at night. He could be healed by moonlight. He was, sort of harassing high society. Then, of course, we have the knight Azo, who I already went through all that. But one other little tidbit about Sir Azo is that when they offer him food and drink, he actually tells them, "I never drink wine." Fascinating, right? Yeah, so there's that, and then of course we come to Carmilla. Carmilla not only was the first vampire who could change her shape into an animal, she could become a giant cat, a giant black cat. Dracula then was able to become a giant black dog or a wolf or a bat, so we get that from Carmilla. But also, Carmilla takes place in a county in Austria called Styria, which is where Bram Stoker set Dracula up until very late in the writing of it, when he suddenly learned about Transylvania, learned about the historic Vlad Tepes, and was like, Dracula? That's a great name. And he moved the whole thing to Transylvania. So that, my friends, is the path from the literary vampire all the way up to Dracula. These are my sources and my fabulous artists who did some illustrations for me. These are all the places you can find me at the Vampire's Castle. My name is Sean Rourke. Thank you guys very much. You are a fabulous audience. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Excellent job, Sean. Keep it going for Sean, everyone. We open the floor to questions. If you have a question, please approach on the mic.
Hi. I have a two-part question.
Please.
One, what do you think it is about vampires that make them these kind of eternal characters that we all kind of keep coming back to? And part two, Count Dracula, how does he play into this?
Yes, Count Dracula gets overlooked quite a bit. The fact that he came out after Dracula is probably telling, but as far as like why vampires stay so beloved after all of these centuries now, Dracula is entering into its third century of existence. People have written entire books and essays about this question. My personal thing is that I think that there is. We as humans are attracted to the things that are bad for us. And vampires represent a dark lover, a dark harasser, the other side of the question of what happens to us when we die. There's a mystery and a darkness that we're just very attracted to, and I think that's always going to be the case. So, thank you.
Hello. Yes, wonderful talk. I'm going to go home and watch Castlevania.
Oh, lovely.
I'm not sure you mentioned this, but do you know the origins of the word vampire?
Oh, that's a very good question. So vampire, it's interesting because vampires are called all sorts of different names based on geographic regions. They're Upirs, they are Vordolacs, Vrikolakis, depending on the area of Eastern Europe that you are. I think that Upir is the Russian word, sort of Russian-Ukrainian word, and I think that just, for whatever reason, just sort of made it into the vernacular in Western Europe and became sort of the de facto name, translated, alliterated to vampire. That's my understanding of what happened, but I'm not a linguist, so, but interesting fact, the word Nosferatu, which gets used in Dracula, we have no idea where that word comes from. We don't know where Stoker came up with that, like where he heard that from, and that is a real mystery that hopefully someday somebody's going to solve someday. So, thank you.
Yeah, great talk. Thank you so much. Yeah, I was curious in terms of like the chronology of powers or weaknesses being added to vampires when sunlight being deadly for vampires. Like, has that always been around because they are associated with night, or was it introduced at a certain point?
I can tell you the exact point where sunlight was introduced as a weakness, and that was in the year 1922 when the film Nosferatu hit the screen. That was F.W. Murnau's silent vampire picture. It was an unlicensed adaptation of Dracula, still very scary. And that scene where Orlok walks past the window and the sunlight hits him and he just does a nice lap dissolve to smoke, where did that come from? Like, nobody knows. Like, that's not in the book Dracula. Nobody who worked on that movie ever gave an interview about where they came up with that. But that immediately became part of vampire mythology in the modern day and was then used in actual adaptations of Dracula after that, even though it doesn't appear in the book at all. So there's some thought that, like, you know, spirits of evil are banished at daybreak. This is a thing that goes way back into prehistory, but that's the very first time that it was ever used. It was never part of mythology before that. Good question.
This will be our last question.
Oh, sorry guys, but I'll be around. We can definitely talk.
Hi. So I had actually heard that a lot of these vampire attributes, like sensitivity to sunlight and to blood, are related to diseases, like diseases of the blood that make people sensitive to sunlight or very pale. Is there actually any evidence where, you know, vampirism maybe people suffered from a disease that people 1,000 years ago were like, vampire? Or is that something that we're kind of linking retroactively?
That's an excellent question, and yes, 100%. So sensitivity to sunlight, if I'm remembering correctly, and any of the doctors in here correct me, but I believe that is a condition called porphyria, which is an allergic reaction to ultraviolet light. Like I say, that was never part of the mythology, so that doesn't actually have anything to do with the vampire myth. We've sort of added that on in these sort of later years, but the big disease origin for vampires is tuberculosis. It's actually several things, but tuberculosis is the main one. So back in Eastern Europe, and interestingly enough, New England, here in America, there are several...
Eastern Europe of America.
Exactly. Immigrants from Europe would move over here, and during times of pre-medicine, before anybody knew what diseases were, germs or anything like that, tuberculosis would start to affect somebody. That person would die. They would get buried, and then members of their family would start to get sick. And so there was a thought that the person that they buried was rising from their grave at night somehow and draining the energy or the life force from the rest of the living family. And they would go and they would dig up the body and open up the coffin, and they would find fresh blood on the mouth, sometime coming out of the ears. The body would appear bloated.
And we do in New England.
Their hair and fingernails would have grown since they were buried, and then when you drive a stake through their heart or dismember them with any kind of puncturing, they would let out a
Did they do this to non-tuberculous corpses?
See, that's the thing. That would have happened to any corpse that they opened a coffin up to, because those are all things that happen as you decompose. But most people didn't go around opening up the coffins of people that they had buried. They were only accustomed to seeing decay happen out in the wild, in the environment, where microorganisms and carrion creatures would break down a body very quickly. When you stuff them, you nail them into a pine box and bury them underground, they decompose at a much slower rate, and the body inflates due to gases of the internal organs breaking down. The skin starts to retract from the fingernails in the scalp area, making it look like the hair is growing. Seepage happens of liquefied stuff going on, and so when you open that up, you just immediately start telling yourselves all kinds of stories, and then they would exhume the heart, and they would burn it, and they would make a tea out of it, and they would have everybody drink it. So people were drinking tuberculosis straight up as a remedy, and for some reason these vampires were just plaguing villages for long periods of time.
Fascinating. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
One more time for Sean, everyone. Drinking tuberculosis is so bad. Yes.
That was so much fun. Now, you're probably asking, what was this event that I went to? So this was something called NERD Nite, specifically NERD Nite LA, but NERD Nite is something that happens all over the country, and actually in many places around the world. And it's kind of like TED Talks, but with alcohol. They do this once a month in some sort of a bar, and they have essentially 3 different speakers get up and just talk about something that they're an expert in for 20 minutes. I mean, I'm more of a hobbyist than an expert, granted, and they are very nerdy topics every time. So if you want to find out more about NERD Nite, I'll put the links down there below. Otherwise, I hope you had a good time finding out about the vampires who came before Dracula. I think this is actually going to make a really great primer for this whole series. So each of those vampires that I talked about, I will go in depth on and giving each one their own episode. And I've already done 2 of them. 1 of them. 2 of them. So I've already done an episode entirely about Carmilla. You can find that here. And then I've also done one about Lilith, who was not in this talk, because she's way back much earlier than any of the literary vampires. But you can find that here. And then moving forward, we're going to be talking about Lord Ruthven and the Knight Azo and Varney the Vampire and Christabel and Lady Duquesne. And so we'll be getting into a bunch of these, and I can't wait to introduce you to them. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you, NERDNite, for having me, and we'll see you next time.